So what is the difference between priority needs, medical priority, banding, priority banding, sometimes priority points, all these different terms that use this word priority when it comes to housing? And this is a really important question in the sense that it can be the difference between someone getting housed at all and getting housed fairly quickly. So although it's very boring, it is worth paying attention to. And really, to explain this as best I can, I guess I need to give a little bit of the kind of framework that the law operates within. So Housing Act 1996 is kind of the overarching legislation. It covers lots of other different bits. It's been amended by a few things. So you might have heard of the Homelessness Reduction Act, for example, or the Domestic Abuse Act. That simply amends the Housing Act 1996 in various ways. So when you hear people talk about Section 189A of the Homelessness Reduction Act, that's not really technically a way of actually saying it at all. It's Section 189A of the Housing Act 1996, but it's been amended by the HRA. So you've got this legislation, it's there. There are 7 parts in it, so 7 chapters, so to speak. And Part 6 and Part 7 are the ones you actually want to care about. So Part 6 is essentially the law governing how councils allocate their social housing in England. And when I say social housing, I mean council housing or housing association accommodation, that sort of thing. So that's all about that, and effectively anyone can apply for assistance. It's just that the criteria are often very strict. And then you've got Part 7 of the Housing Act, which essentially is the process for people who might be homeless or they might be threatened with homelessness. And confusingly, these parts use the same or very similar language in both parts but mean very different things. And I've done a video about how local connection under Part 7 and local connection under Part 6 are very, very different. So under Part 6 in Hillingdon, if you want to get local connection through residence, you need to have lived there for 10 years. Whereas under Part 7, the homeless application route, you'd only need to technically live there for 6 months in some circumstances. So you can see situations where actually someone might not be able to get housed through Part 6 at all, but they would be if they're homeless, because essentially if you think of Part 6 as a very high wall that you've got to get over, Part 7 can in some circumstances act as a bit of a side gate, which just allows you to walk around nice and easily, if you understand what the analogy is there. So one of the key words that you'll see within these processes is this term priority. I can't give a particularly definitive definition of Part 6 and the use of the word priority because every council's got a different policy, and there's something like 300 housing authorities in England, so there's lots of different policies out there. Often they're kind of similar. There are some outliers. So for example, most housing allocation policies will use some kind of banding system, whether they call it band A to D or band 1 to 4 or gold, silver, bronze, or whatever they want to call it. Then some councils like Southampton have like a point system still. So and they can kind of define that within a remit, you know, fairly freely. I guess there are a few things that have to apply, and there's a few interesting things which I guess I'll bring in here. So people who are owed either the prevention, relief or main housing duty have to be able to get onto the housing register, even if it's a low banding. They have to, it's called reasonable preference. They have to actually get onto the banding system. So technically you might be threatened with homelessness. If a council you approach is efficient, you should be able to bid on properties fairly quickly. But realise that actually because you're at potentially the lowest band, it might take many years to actually get a house. So it may not actually really make a difference for you in that period. But ultimately, once you get through the homeless application process, and let's assume that you're owed the main housing duty, often you'll get a relatively high banding at in that situation. So most councils I see kind of give it the second highest banding if you're owed the main housing duty. So, and just to kind of say, when you're looking through the council's policy, the language it will use are things like homeless applicants owed the main housing duty, and that'll be like a separate subcategory of a band. So that's kind of, hopefully kind of gives you a bit of an inkling of how to read them. So as I say, if you're owed the main housing duty, you're going to get a relatively high band. And I've done other videos about this in some detail, but effectively there's 5 questions that need to be ascertained to work out if you're going to be owed the main housing duty. And that is, are you actually homeless? Are you actually eligible for assistance, which basically means having recourse to public funds? Are you in priority needs? Is local connection taken care of in some way? There's various ways that can happen. And are you not intentionally homeless? So are you unintentionally homeless? Now, if all of those 5 things apply, you're owed the main housing duty. And so that opens up the possibility of a reasonable prospect of getting housed in social housing. Although, again, it varies massively from council to council. Increasingly, councils are using private rented sector discharges as a way of ending that duty. So, as I've said elsewhere, making a homeless application does not in any way guarantee that you're going to get social housing at the end of it. The council can legitimately discharge their duty into the private rented sector. So we kind of have this term, as I say, I've mentioned it already, priority needs. That is one of the 5 tests, and Priority need is a term which is legislated for across England, so you're always going to have that term priority need used within the Part 7 homeless application process, because Part 7 is always the same, whereas Part 6 is different from area to area. So that term priority needs means something very specific. Again, I've done lots of videos on the channel as to what it means. So it's situations like having a dependent child, having a pregnant woman in your household, having medical issues, having other vulnerabilities, that sort of thing, being homeless because of fire or flood, 16, 17-year-olds and so on. So there's a whole bunch of criteria that would meet priority needs. Once the council has accepted you're in priority need, you don't have to deal with that ever again. However, you will then end up on the housing register, and that is when the council's own policy, the Part 6 policy, will kick in. They'll use a whole range of permutations of the word priority. As I say, it might be medical priority, it might be priority banding, it might be priority points. Those are all Part 6 criteria, that's all Part 6 jargon. And it seems like a cop-out, but effectively you would need to look into your own council's policy. You can effectively do that just by Googling council's name and the term housing allocation scheme, because that should pop up with their policy. And within that policy there'll be a number of different sections. There'll be a section about banding, and you'll often have kind of, band A, emergency, about to die, that sort of thing, domestic abuse, those kind of things. And then often band B, the second highest band, will have applicants owed a main housing duty, something like that, and that'll kind of tell you what band you would end up in. But within that you might still see terms like medical priority. So for example, it might be that certain councils have a policy where if you have certain medical conditions, or you're assessed as having certain medical conditions, that would give you additional priority, even more priority than someone who just owed the main housing duty. And equally it might be, for example, you need wheelchair accessible accommodation, something like that, that might give you additional points. As I mentioned Southampton earlier, Southampton's policy is a real kind of, couldn't make sense of it to be honest, but I'm sure it makes sense to them. But they kind of, you have different points, 30 points for this, 20 points for that, and you kind of add them together and that gives your overall score, I guess. But that's unusual. Most councils just have a straightforward banding system. So as I say, the policy itself should set out how they assess medical priority or whatever it would be, and it may well cover the same types of information that you've already supplied that was taken into account during the priority need decision, but effectively it's a different, they're applying it differently now. It's more about what type of accommodation do you need and so on, rather than do you have a priority need at all. And so that's kind of why it can get quite confusing. I guess to try and make this, try and kind of say some black and white things that might help you understand it. If you're dealing with a council, you may not know whether you're actually being dealt with under Part 6 or Part 7, but if they're using the term priority need within the letters they're sending out to you, that is a sure sign that they're dealing with your application as a homeless application. And if you are homeless or threatened with homelessness, in almost every situation you're better off being dealt with under Part 7 rather than Part 6. It gets a little bit complicated, and I might as well explain it now. If you apply under the generic Part 6 application form, which is often the one which is on the council's website, it won't say it's the Part 6 application form, but that's essentially what it is. But in doing so, you give the council reasons to believe that you might be homeless. Let's say, for example, because you're at risk of domestic abuse, or you can't afford your rent, something like that. Then the Code of Guidance, the council's rule book, states that councils should be really careful to pick up on those types of cases and divert them down the Part 7 route. So again, if you think about Part 6 as being a very high wall you've got to get over, councils should be very alert to situations which might actually mean that the person needs to be dealt with under that Part 7 side alley route, so to speak, rather than kind of waiting around not getting temporary accommodation just on the housing register for years. Because one of the main advantages of Part 7 is you get the offer of temporary accommodation if there is reason to believe that you might be homeless, might be eligible, might have a priority need. So that's kind of a few bits around that. And again, the only advantage, and this is a little bit complicated, the only advantage of staying under Part 6 if you're actually homeless is that it does afford you more choice when you actually come down to it. So you'll see some people who are legally homeless, but they're living, let's say they're sofa surfing in effect. They might say to the council, look, actually I can live with this for the time being. I would rather be dealt with under Part 6 rather than Part 7. But Part 7 is the default, and really those types of situations are actually very rare. So let's say, for example, they're living kind of with family members on a reasonably stable basis. They are legally homeless, but it's kind of, it can work for them. And let's say the waiting times are such that in that particular local authority, it's only going to be a matter of months before they get housed. That will afford, as I say, that will afford them more choice on the housing register, because under Part 7, often these days, you don't really get any choice. As soon as a property comes up that is technically suitable for you, or the council deems as suitable for you, if you don't bid for it, they'll stick you on it automatically anyway. That's the kind of way it works. I'm being a bit clumsy about that, but that's kind of how it works. Whereas if you're remaining under Part 6, you have the ability to kind of, not bid on properties, whatever, and there's no real comeback for that. But I would say, as I say, that's very rare that that's actually going to be a good idea, because it could take years, And the bottom line is, if the relationship breaks down in a year's time and you have to make a homeless application, the whole waiting time basically resets and you start from zero. So I wouldn't say it's a good idea. I'm saying it's technically possible, but just importantly, the default is that council should treat your housing register application, if you might be homeless, as a homeless application automatically. You shouldn't need to ask for it to happen like that. It just should happen. So priority needs is exclusively used within the Part 7 process, but you've got these other terminology which is used later on, or just for direct applications to Part 6. But it does get very confusing, and you just need to check out the council's own policy if you're going to really kind of go down that route. And it does take time. Often policies will be 30 or 50 pages long, but the sections you need to worry about will actually be quite short. So for example, there'll be a whole section about antisocial behaviour and how it bars you from the register. If you haven't committed any antisocial behaviour, you just skip through that section, so you can kind of get through quite a lot of it without having to read it.